For more than a decade, Europe was engulfed in a series of wars that would reshape the continent forever. Armies marched across borders, empires rose and fell, and entire nations were drawn into a conflict driven by ambition, revolution, and power. These conflicts would become known as the Napoleonic Wars. To understand how Europe reached this point, we must begin with the aftermath of the French Revolution. The old monarchy had been overthrown, and France was no longer ruled by a king. Instead, a new political order had emerged, one that challenged the traditional balance of power across Europe. Monarchies feared that revolutionary ideas would spread beyond France and threaten their own rule. As tensions grew, several European powers formed coalitions against France. Their goal was clear: to contain the revolution and restore stability. But France was no longer weak or divided. Its armies were motivated, reorganized, and driven by a sense of purpose that set them apart from the traditional forces of Europe. Out of this environment emerged a young and ambitious general, Napoleon Bonaparte. Rising quickly through the ranks, Napoleon proved himself to be a brilliant military strategist. His early campaigns in Italy brought him fame and demonstrated his ability to defeat larger and more experienced armies. In 1799, Napoleon seized power in France through a political coup. He established himself as first consul, effectively becoming the ruler of the country. A few years later, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. With this, France was no longer just a revolutionary state. It had become an empire under Napoleon's control. Under his leadership, France entered a new phase of conflict. Napoleon sought not only to defend France, but to expand its influence across Europe. Through a series of rapid and decisive campaigns, he defeated multiple coalitions formed against him. Victories at battles such as Austerlitz and Jena showcased his military genius. As Napoleon's power grew, so did the size of his empire. He reorganized territories, placed allies and family members on European thrones, and spread reforms influenced by the revolution. In many areas, old feudal systems were weakened or abolished, and new legal structures were introduced. Despite these successes, cracks in Napoleon's system were becoming more visible. Governing such a vast empire required constant control, and even small rebellions could threaten stability. Resistance movements began to emerge, especially in regions where French rule was seen as foreign domination rather than liberation. One of the most notable examples was the conflict in Spain, where Napoleon's forces faced fierce guerrilla warfare. Local fighters used unconventional tactics, making it difficult for the French army to maintain control. This prolonged struggle drained resources and showed that even Napoleon's powerful army had its limits. However, his dominance created growing resistance. Britain remained one of his strongest opponents, using its naval power to challenge France. Unable to defeat Britain at sea, Napoleon attempted to weaken it economically through the continental system, a blockade designed to cut off British trade with Europe. The system, however, proved difficult to enforce. Many nations depended on trade with Britain, and smuggling became widespread. Instead of strengthening his control, the policy often created resentment among his allies and territories under his influence. In 1812, Napoleon made a critical decision that would change the course of the war. He launched a massive invasion of Russia, aiming to force it back into compliance with his system. At first, his army advanced deep into Russian territory, but the campaign quickly turned into disaster. The sheer scale of the invasion created enormous logistical challenges. Supplying such a large army across vast distances proved nearly impossible. As the troops advanced, they became increasingly cut off from food, equipment, and reinforcements, weakening their ability to continue the abécéne. Russian strategy played a crucial role in Napoleon's defeat. Instead of engaging in decisive battles, Russian forces retreated deeper into their territory, destroying resources along the way. This scorched earth tactic left Napoleon's army with little to sustain itself as it moved forward. Russian forces avoided direct confrontation and instead retreated, destroying supplies along the way. As winter approached, Napoleon's army faced extreme cold, starvation, and constant attacks. The retreat from Moscow became one of the most devastating moments of the war, with only a fraction of his army returning. After this failure, Napoleon's enemies saw an opportunity. a new coalition formed, determined to defeat him once and for all. In 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, Napoleon suffered a major defeat. His control over Europe began to collapse. As his empire crumbled, many of Napoleon's former allies turned against him. States that had once supported or feared him now joined the coalition, hoping to secure their own positions in a post-Napoleonic Europe. His isolation grew rapidly. One by one, the alliances he had carefully built began to collapse. Nations that had once relied on his protection now saw an opportunity to regain their independence and influence. The balance of power was shifting, and Napoleon found himself increasingly alone. For years, his dominance had seemed unbreakable. His victories had reshaped the map of Europe, and his presence had forced even the most powerful monarchies to adapt. But now that dominance was slipping away. Former allies no longer saw him as a protector, but as a risk. Supporting Napoleon had once meant survival. Now, abandoning him meant opportunity. The final years of the war showed how quickly power could shift. Within a short time, Napoleon went from dominating most of Europe to fighting for his own survival. The same speed and aggression that had once brought him victory could no longer guarantee success. His enemies had adapted, learning from past defeats and coordinating their efforts more effectively. Meanwhile, his own resources were stretched thin, and the constant strain of war weakened both his army and his empire. Coalition forces began to move with greater confidence. Instead of facing Napoleon one by one, they acted together, combining their strength and avoiding the mistakes that had cost them so dearly in the past. Their strategy was no longer based on fear, but on patience and coordination. Slowly but steadily, they pushed back against his remaining forces. Military setbacks became more frequent, and morale within his forces began to decline. Soldiers who had once marched confidently across Europe now faced exhaustion and uncertainty. Supplies were harder to secure, reinforcements were fewer, and the sense of invincibility that had defined Napoleon's earlier campaigns was fading. The tide of war had clearly turned against him. Desertions increased, and even experienced officers began to question whether victory was still possible. The long years of near-constant warfare had taken their toll. Many soldiers were no longer fighting for glory or ambition, but simply to survive. The energy and confidence that had once defined Napoleon's army were slowly being replaced by fatigue and doubt. At the same time, the populations of occupied territories grew increasingly resistant. What had once been accepted, or even welcomed, as reform was now seen as control. Local uprisings, resistance movements, and acts of defiance became more common. Holding the empire together required more force than ever before, further draining Napoleon's already limited resources. In 1814, coalition forces entered Paris. Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. For a moment it seemed that the long years of war had finally come to an end. Across Europe, there was a sense of cautious relief. Leaders began discussing how to rebuild stability and prevent another figure like Napoleon from rising again. The continent, exhausted by years of conflict, longed for peace. The fall of Paris marked more than just a military defeat. It symbolized the collapse of an empire that had once dominated Europe. For many, it was the end of an era defined by constant war and uncertainty. Yet the future remained unclear. The question was no longer how to defeat Napoleon, but how to rebuild a stable Europe in his absence. Diplomats and rulers began to consider how power should be distributed moving forward. There was a shared understanding that no single nation should be allowed to dominate the continent in the same way again. However, even in defeat, Napoleon remained a powerful symbol. His legacy, both feared and admired, continued to shape political decisions across Europe. While many hoped that his exile marked the end of an era, others remained uncertain, aware that his story might not yet be over. Even from exile, his influence lingered. Soldiers who had once served under him remembered his leadership. Citizens across Europe still felt the effects of the systems he had introduced. His rise and fall had changed expectations of power, leadership, and what one individual could achieve.
In 1815, Napoleon returned from exile in a dramatic comeback known as the 100 Days. He quickly regained control of France and once again prepared for war. However, his return was short-lived. At the Battle of Waterloo, he faced a coalition army led by the Duke of Wellington and supported by Prussian forces. After a fierce and decisive battle, Napoleon was defeated and exiled once and for all to the island St. Helena, bringing his final attempt at power to an end.
For some, Napoleon represented chaos and destruction. For others, he symbolized progress and reform. This divided legacy ensured that his story would not simply fade away. Instead, it remained a point of reflection for a continent trying to redefine itself after years of war. And while Europe looked toward a future of peace, there was an underlying awareness that stability was fragile. The memory of how quickly order had turned into conflict remained fresh. The end of Napoleon's rule did not erase the tensions that had fueled his rise. It only marked the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter in European history,